The grain was gone. That was what Joel Mercer had been told, and what he had believed with the full, crushing weight of a man who understood what that meant for his cattle, for his ranch, for every soul depending on him from the Rio Picos to the Canyon Ridge. He had ridden hard into Coldwater Creek on that bitter February morning of 1878, his jaw locked tight, and his dark eyes carrying the particular desperation of a man watching everything he had built begin to crack at its foundation. 300 head of cattle, 40 ranch hands, 2,000 acres of Texas ranchland that had survived drought, raids, and the railroad men who thought they could buy him out. He had endured all of it. But without grain to supplement the cattle feed through the last killing weeks of winter, when the grassland lay dead and brown and brittle as old bone, the herd would start dropping within days. And then Virginia Hayes had looked him dead in the eye and said something that stopped his breath. "You want to know what I think, Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was calm, infuriatingly composed, carrying that particular clarity that only belonged to a person who held all the cards and knew exactly how many they had. She stood in the wide doorway of the Hayes mill, flour dust drifting around her like a kind of halo, her dark hair pinned up but coming loose at the temples from a morning of hard work. She was not a small woman in terms of presence. She filled that doorway completely. "I think you rode in here ready to bury me with your disappointment, ready to tell the whole county that Virginia Hayes let the Mercer ranch down. But here is the thing you do not know yet." Joel had stood there in the cold morning air, his hat in his hand, his pride already swallowed because the situation demanded it. He had never spoken more than 3 words to this woman in his life. Had seen her from a distance at the county fair the previous autumn, standing at her mill machinery with the kind of easy authority that made other men look uncertain. He had heard the talk, of course. Everyone in Coldwater Creek had heard the talk. A woman running the Hayes mill alone after her father's death, taking on contracts, managing the workers, operating machinery that most men in the county barely understood. Some called it impressive, others called it unnatural. Joel Mercer had not formed a strong opinion either way. He was a cattleman. He dealt in cattle things. But now this woman was looking at him with something that was not pity and was not cruelty, and it was piercing him straight through because he could not name what it was. "What don't I know?" he heard himself say. Virginia Hayes smiled then, and it transformed her face entirely. She stepped back and gestured behind her into the cool, dark interior of the mill building, toward the stone steps that led down to the lower storage cellar that most people in Coldwater Creek did not even know existed. "Come and see," she said, and what he saw in that cellar would change everything. Not just for the cattle, not just for the winter, but for both of their lives, in ways that neither of them had the wisdom yet to predict, standing there in the flour-dusted light with a secret reserve of grain stretching out before them in the shadows. To understand why that moment hit Joel Mercer the way it did, you have to go back 2 weeks, to the night when everything he thought he knew came apart. It had been a clear, cold night in late January when the telegram arrived from the Abilene grain supplier, delivered by a boy on a mule who looked half-frozen and deeply miserable. Joel had been in the ranch house dining room, reviewing the winter feed calculations with his foreman, Amos Tate, a lean, weathered man of 50 with a permanent squint from 30 years of western sun. They had spread the ledgers across the heavy oak table that Joel's father had built with his own hands, and the numbers were already worrying. The supplemental grain supply they had counted on from the Hayes Mill's most recent milling contract was set to arrive at the end of the month. It was not a luxury. In the worst weeks of the Texas winter, when the grazing land gave nothing and the cattle burned calories just standing in the cold, supplemental grain was the difference between a living herd and a dead one. The telegram was short and without mercy. Mill contract canceled. Hayes Mill unable to fulfill winter grain order. No alternative supplier within reasonable distance. Regrets expressed. Joel had read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the table with a deliberateness that Amos recognized immediately as the kind of careful movement a man made when he was keeping himself from reacting in a way he would regret. "How bad?" Amos asked. "Bad enough," Joel said. The truth was worse than that. The truth was that Joel had already stretched his finances thin this winter, investing heavily in a new breeding program and in improvements to the north pasture fencing that had been in dangerous disrepair since the summer storms. He had made those investments confident in the stability of his winter feed arrangements. The telegram ripped that stability out from under him like a board from a rotten floor. He sent 3 queries out the next morning to suppliers in San Antonio, Laredo, and Fort Worth. The responses came back over the following days, each one a variation on the same theme: too far, too expensive, backlogged, unable to deliver before late March at the earliest. Late March was too late. The critical window was now. The next 4 to 6 weeks. Joel began the grim mathematics of triage. Which sections of the herd could be sustained on existing hay reserves alone? Which animals were most vulnerable? Whether he could push the yearlings to early sale at a loss to reduce the feeding burden. Every option he ran cost him something he could not afford to lose. The breeding program he had worked 2 years to develop. The herd composition he had carefully built. The reputation of the Mercer Ranch, which was the most valuable thing his family had ever built, and the one thing he absolutely refused to let his father's memory down by destroying. Amos had been the one to finally say it. "The Hayes Mill," the old foreman said one morning over coffee. "I know the telegram said the contract was canceled, but have you actually ridden down there and spoken to the woman herself?" Joel looked up from his coffee. "The contract was canceled. That's what the telegram said." "Telegrams don't lie, Amos." "People send telegrams," Amos said, with the patience of a man who had survived enough frontier surprises to maintain a healthy skepticism about clean, simple explanations. "Telegrams get written by people. Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes people make decisions that other people don't know about yet. I'm just saying you're about to start selling off your best yearlings at a loss based on a piece of paper. Might be worth having a conversation first." Joel had sat with that for a full day before pride relented to practicality. Which was how he found himself riding into Coldwater Creek on a cold February morning with his hat in his hand, and his pride already costing him money. Coldwater Creek was not a large town by 1878 standards, but it was a functional one. The main street ran 2 blocks long, with a livery, a dry goods store, a bank that had been robbed twice and rebuilt twice with notable stubbornness, a saloon, a doctor's office, and various other structures that defined the working life of a frontier community. The Hayes Mill sat at the east end of town, just past the last row of houses, positioned where it always had been, next to the branch of Coldwater Creek that gave the town its name, and that provided the water power the original mill had used before Virginia's father had modernized it with a steam assist system 3 years before his death. Oliver Hayes had been a respected man in this community. A miller who understood his trade deeply, and who had served the surrounding ranches and farms with genuine skill. His death from a heart attack 18 months ago had sent a quiet shock through the county, followed by a more complicated reaction when it became clear that his daughter, Virginia, intended to take over the operation entirely and run it herself. Most people had expected her to fail within 6 months, or to sell, or to find a husband who would take over the real work while she managed the household accounts. None of these things had happened. Virginia Hayes was 27 years old, had spent her entire life learning the mill trade from her father, understood every mechanical component of the operation, managed the business contracts with a precision that the county's most organized men would have envied, and showed absolutely no inclination to be saved, rescued, or managed by anyone. There was a dark thread running through the story, though, that most people only partially understood. Oliver Hayes, in the last year of his life, had taken on a significant business loan from a man named Cyrus Dold, who operated the regional commodities trading house out of San Antonio and who had a reputation for offering money with one hand and a trap with the other. The loan terms were complex. Virginia understood them completely, which was more than Oliver had fully done by the time he signed. After her father's death, Virginia had been navigating those loan terms with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else, but Cyrus Dold had been quietly maneuvering against her. He wanted the mill. He wanted the property. And the most effective tool he had for getting both was to cut off the mill's primary business relationships. The canceled telegram was not a coincidence. Virginia knew this. She had known for 3 months that Dold was working angles in the background, had been watching the specific business relationships that were quietly undermined, one by one. The Mercer Ranch contract cancellation had his fingerprints all over it, though the fingerprints were subtle enough that proving anything was another matter entirely. What Cyrus Dold did not know was that Virginia Hayes had been planning for exactly this kind of betrayal for almost a year. The reserve grain supply in the lower cellar of the Hayes mill was the physical embodiment of that planning. 6 months ago, Virginia had begun quietly accumulating an additional grain reserve beyond the standard operational stock, milling it herself in off hours, and storing it in the cellar that her father had originally dug for equipment storage, and that very few people knew existed. She had told no one about it. Not her 2 mill workers, Bart and Clem, who were good men but not known for their discretion. Not her neighbor, Mrs. Adler, who was kind but who talked. Not anyone. The reserve was her secret weapon against the day when Dold made his move and tried to make it look like the mill had failed to deliver on its commitments. Because if the mill could not fulfill its contracts, the loan terms gave Dold the legal opening he needed to move against her. But if the mill could fulfill its contracts despite Dold's interference, the story was entirely different. She had been waiting for someone to come to her directly, rather than accepting the telegram as the final word. Most people would not. Most people, presented with a telegram saying a contract was canceled, would take that at face value and begin making other arrangements. Virginia had gambled that at least one of her major customers was stubborn enough, or desperate enough, or simply practical enough to ride into town and ask. When she saw Joel Mercer's horse tied at the post outside the mill that cold February morning, she felt a tight, quiet relief bloom in her chest that she kept carefully off her face. Joel Mercer was not what she had expected. She had seen him before, of course, in the way that everyone in a small frontier community sees everyone else without ever having a real conversation. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of weathered physical presence that comes from genuine outdoor labor rather than performance. He was 32, she knew, a bachelor who had been too busy building his ranch to look for anything else. He had a reputation for being straight-spoken, fair-dealing, and occasionally inflexible when he thought he was right. That last quality was both a liability and a potential asset, depending on what he decided to be right about. He was standing in her doorway looking like a man who had eaten something bitter and was maintaining dignity about it, and Virginia found this more endearing than she would have predicted. "Mr. Mercer," she said, keeping her voice even, "this is unexpected." "I got a telegram," he said, "saying the contract was canceled. Did you? I need to understand why." He paused. "Please." The please cost him something. She could see that. It was not the please of a man who said it often or easily, and the fact that he had said it here to her in this situation told her more about his character than anything else he could have done. "Come inside," she said. She made coffee. This was a deliberate choice on her part, because it forced a slower rhythm on the conversation, required both of them to sit down in the small office adjacent to the main mill floor, surrounded by the smell of ground grain and machine oil, and the faint metallic scent of the steam boiler warming up for the morning's work. Joel sat across the small table from her, and wrapped his hands around the tin cup she gave him, and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that patience was a survival skill. Virginia told him a version of the truth, carefully calibrated. She told him that the telegram had not originated from her, that someone had interfered with the contract arrangement through channels she was still untangling, and that she was aware the Mercer ranch was in a difficult position as a result. Joel Mercer's expression changed as she spoke. The bitter dignity gave way to something sharper. His dark eyes moved from careful politeness to active attention, the way a man's eyes change when the information he is receiving suddenly matters. "Someone interfered," he repeated. "Yes. Who?" "I have strong suspicions," she said. "I would rather not name them until I have more than suspicions." He sat with that for a moment. Then, "Does it change whether you can supply the grain?" She looked at him steadily. "That depends on what you know about the storage cellar beneath this building." She watched the confusion cross his face, and take something else that she recognized from a lifetime of dealing with men who underestimated her. She recognized the exact moment when confusion was about to transform into genuine surprise. "Follow me," she said. She took a lantern from the hook by the office door and led him through the mill floor, past the great stone grinding wheels that her father had brought in piece by piece from a quarry in East Texas, past the steam boiler with its warm, breathing presence, to the iron hatch set flush into the floor at the far end of the building. She pulled the hatch up with practiced ease, lit the lantern's wick from a match she struck on the stone floor, and descended the wooden steps into the cellar below. Joel Mercer followed her down. The reserve was not modest. 6 months of careful accumulation, stacked in the cool, dry dark of a cellar that Virginia had treated with lime to prevent moisture, and lined with oilcloth on the floor to protect against the ground. Sacks of milled grain, methodically labeled and dated, stacked in rows that spoke of genuine organizational intelligence, of a mind that had thought not just about gathering the supply, but about maintaining its quality through the weeks it would need to sit. Joel stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at it in silence for a long moment. Virginia held the lantern up so the light reached every corner and let him see all of it. When he finally turned to look at her, his expression was something she had never seen on a man's face before in quite that configuration. It was not the patronizing approval that men sometimes offered women who surprised them, that particular look that said "well done" for a woman. It was something different. It was a clean, uncomplicated shock, followed immediately and without transition by a respect so direct and genuine that it slightly embarrassed him, and then something else, something softer that he did not recognize in himself yet. "You stored this," he said. "It was not a question. You planned for this." "I knew something like this was coming," she said. "I did not know exactly when or in what form, so I prepared." "How long have you been building this reserve?" 6 months approximately. He looked at the stacks again, then back at her. "On your own." "On my own." Joel Mercer was quiet for another full moment. Then he said in a voice that was entirely different from the one he had walked in with, quieter and more honest, "Miss Hayes, I owe you an apology." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "For assuming the telegram was the whole story," he said. "For riding in here ready to be disappointed. I should have come sooner and asked, instead of spending 2 weeks trying to fix something that you had already handled." Virginia felt something warm shift in her chest. She did not show it. "The grain is here, Mr. Mercer. The question is whether we can arrange delivery and whether the terms still work for your situation." "The terms work," he said immediately. "Whatever the original terms were." "There's one additional thing," she said, and her voice shifted just slightly, carrying a weight that he picked up on immediately. "This reserve is the difference between me fulfilling my contracts and not fulfilling them this winter. That matters not just for my customers. It matters for my business relationship with the loan I carry." Joel looked at her directly. "Tell me about the loan." And she did. Not all of it, not the full frightening details, but enough. Cyrus doled. The loan terms. The way the contract cancellations fit a pattern that could, if they continued, give Dole a technical basis to demand repayment on an accelerated timeline that the mill's current cash flow could not support. Joel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, he's trying to take the mill. Yes. By making you look like you can't fulfill your contracts. Yes. And if you fulfill your contracts despite what he did, then he loses his leverage. For now, she met his eyes. This is not a permanent solution. He will try something else. But right now, this winter, the grain is the immediate battle. Joel looked at the reserve once more, then at Virginia. Something in his expression had settled into a kind of resolve that she recognized as the same quality in herself. The quality of a person who, when they understood the shape of a fight, stopped being uncertain about which side they were on. "I'll take delivery of the grain," he said. "Full contracted amount plus additional if you can spare it. And I'll make sure every rancher and farmer in this county knows that the Hayes mill delivered when it said it would." Virginia blinked. It was the only small visible crack in her composure. "That's not required." "No," he said. "But it's right." They climbed back up out of the cellar and stood in the mill floor in the growing morning light. The boiler was warming properly now, the familiar deep vibration of it traveling through the floorboards. Virginia's two workers, Bart and Clem, came in through the main door for the morning shift, nodded respectfully to their employer, and with varying degrees of curiosity at the tall rancher standing next to her. Joel put his hat back on. The bitter dignity from an hour ago was entirely gone, replaced by something easier and more honest. "When can you start delivery?" "I can have the first wagon loaded by this afternoon," Virginia said. "My regular teamster, Mr. Holt, handles the larger deliveries. 2 days to get the full order out to your ranch." "That works." He paused at the door, and she had the distinct impression he was making a small decision about whether to say something. He said it. "I'd like to know more about Dole, not just the loan terms, the man. I have my own dealings with commodity traders, and I know people who know people in San Antonio. It might be useful." Virginia looked at him carefully. "I'm not looking for a rescuer, Mr. Mercer." The corner of his mouth moved, something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "No, I can see that. I'm offering a business alliance, Miss Hayes. You have something I need right now. I might have something useful to you. That's all." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded and went out. She heard his horse move away from the post outside, and then she stood in the mill floor with her two workers pretending very hard not to have observed anything, and she thought about the expression on Joel Mercer's face in the cellar when he had seen the reserve she had built. She thought about it for most of the rest of the day, which was unusual for her, because Virginia Hayes was not generally a person whose mind wandered while she was working. The grain delivery went exactly as she had said. Mr. Holt, her teamster, was a taciturn, dependable man who asked no unnecessary questions and drove his wagon with the competence of someone who had been navigating Texas roads for 20 years. The first load went out on the afternoon of the same day, and the second followed the next morning. And by the second evening, the Mercer Ranch had its supplemental grain, and the immediate crisis for the winter herd was addressed. 3 days later, Joel Mercer sent Virginia a message by way of his foreman Amos Tate, who rode into town to pick up some additional supplies and stopped at the mill on the way through. The message was brief and straightforward, like the man who had written it. He had spoken with his contact in San Antonio, a man named Patterson who tracked commodity trading across the region, and the information that came back was worth sharing. Could she meet with him at the mill at her convenience? Virginia wrote back that Thursday morning would work. He arrived Thursday morning punctually, which she had expected. He brought nothing with him except a folded piece of paper covered in his own handwriting, which she had not expected. She had assumed he would speak from memory. The fact that he had written it down suggested he understood the importance of accuracy. She made coffee again. They sat in the office again. He laid the paper flat on the table between them. What Patterson had found was more concrete than Virginia had hoped. Cyrus Dold had done this before. Not in Texas, but in Kansas, 4 years ago. A similar pattern. A mill operator in debt to Dold's trading house, contracts quietly undermined through back-channel interference, the mill defaulting on its loan, Dold acquiring the property at a fraction of its value and reselling within a year at substantial profit. The Kansas mill operator had been a man, and he had not understood what was happening until it was over. He had not had a hidden reserve. Virginia read the notes twice. Then she looked up at Joel, who was watching her with that direct attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he engaged with things that mattered. "He's done it before," she said. "In Kansas. I'd expect there are others that Patterson didn't find easily. This changes what I can do legally," she said. She was already thinking several moves ahead. If there's a pattern of deliberate contract interference as a business practice, that's not just a private loan dispute anymore. "That's something the county court might be interested in," Joel nodded. "That was my thinking too. I know Judge Harland in Coldwater Creek, not well but well enough to have a conversation." "I don't want you fighting my battles for me," Virginia said, the same tone she had used before, not hostile but firm. "I know," he said, "but I have a stake in this too. If Dold takes this mill, the next mill in the region is 60 miles away. Every rancher and farmer in this county has a stake in the Hayes mill staying operational. This is not only your fight, Miss Hayes." She looked at him. There was something careful and deliberate in the way he framed this, she noticed. He was not saying he wanted to help her because she was a woman who needed help. He was making a practical, community-based argument for mutual interest. It was the correct framing, and the fact that it was correct made her trust it more than if he had been gallant about it. "All right," she said, "but I lead the legal approach. I know the loan documentation better than anyone, and I know exactly where Dold's manipulation is visible in the records." "Agreed," Joel said without hesitation. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the mill machinery began its morning operation, the familiar grinding rhythm that Virginia had grown up with. She found herself noticing, not for the first time, that Joel Mercer seemed entirely comfortable in silence. Most people were not. Most people filled silence with talk because silence felt like a gap that needed closing. Joel sat in it the way he probably sat on his own land, easy with the open space. "Your foreman," Virginia said. "Tate, how long has he been with you?" 15 years. He was with my father before me. "And the ranch itself?" "My father started it. I've been running it for 8 years, since I was 24. You've expanded it." He looked at her with a slight surprise. "You know about that?" "People talk," she said. "I listen." He nodded slowly. "The North Pasture acquisition 2 years ago, and the breeding program." "Which the current situation threatens," she said. "Because you'd been relying on reliable grain supply as part of the winter plan." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I made assumptions I should not have made." "You trusted a system that was working," Virginia said. "That's reasonable. It stopped working because someone interfered with it. The failure is not in your planning, it's in Dold's interference." Something in his expression shifted, softened fractionally. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate reading," she said. "I'm not generally generous with inaccurate assessments." He smiled then. A real one, unexpected, breaking across his face briefly before his natural reserve reasserted itself. It changed his face considerably, Virginia thought. Made him look younger. Made him look like whatever he had been before 8 years of carrying a ranch on his shoulders had put the weight there. She filed that away. Over the following 2 weeks, a working arrangement developed that was, on the surface, entirely practical. Joel had connections and social standing in the county that Virginia, as a woman operating alone, did not have full access to. Not because she lacked competence, but because the social architecture of 1878 Texas was what it was, and there were rooms and conversations that were simply not accessible to a woman without a male counterpart. Virginia had the documentation, the legal knowledge of the loan terms, and the evidence trail. Together they made a complete case. They met at the mill 3 more times to work through the strategy. They met with Judge Harland once, in Joel's presence, and Virginia laid out the case with a clarity and organization that left the judge looking at her with an expression very similar to the one Joel had worn in the cellar. Whatever he had expected from a young woman presenting a legal complaint against a regional commodities trader, this was not it. The judge was not dismissive. He was, in fact, a fair man, one of the genuinely fair ones that the frontier produced in small numbers alongside much larger numbers of the other kind. He listened, he asked questions, he reviewed the documentation, and he told them he would need 2 weeks to review the Kansas precedent that Joel's contact Patterson had provided. Outside the courthouse, standing on the wooden sidewalk in the cold February air, Virginia exhaled and felt the tension in her shoulders release fractionally. "That went well," Joel said. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Why?" "I expected more dismissal, more of the woman question." Joel looked at her directly. "Harland's wife runs half the civic organizations in this town. He's been listening to a capable woman for 30 years. Virginia laughed. It surprised her. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, and it surprised Joel too because he looked at her with a particular attention that had nothing to do with the legal situation and everything to do with the sound of that laugh and what it meant about the person making it. They walked toward the livery where both their horses were kept, and they talked about nothing important for about 2 blocks, the effortless kind of nothing important conversation that was actually the most telling kind, the kind that revealed whether 2 people's minds ran on compatible rails. Virginia talked about the mill machinery and a repair she was planning to the steam system. Joel talked about the new fencing technique he was testing on the north pasture boundary. They were both talking about their work, because their work was the thing they both loved best, and they both recognized this about each other without saying it. At the livery, Joel helped Virginia with her horse, not because she needed it but because it was a natural thing to do when you were standing next to someone and the task was in front of you both. His hands were next to her hands on the bridle for a moment, and they both noticed and both looked in slightly different directions for a moment before things resumed normally. "The next meeting with the judge," Joel said. "Do you want me there?" "Yes," she said. Then, because she was honest, "I appreciate the support, not because I couldn't manage alone, but because it's better with backup." "It always is," he said. She rode home to the mill and spent the evening in her office going over the accounts and trying, with limited success, not to think about the brief warmth of his hands near hers at the livery. She was not a woman given to romance-shaped thinking. She had spent the last 2 years focused entirely on keeping the mill alive and keeping Dole's reach out of it, and before that she had been focused on learning everything her father knew while there was still time to learn it. There had not been significant space in those years for anything else. But she was 27, not 70, and she was not made of the same material as the millstones in the floor below her, and Joel Mercer was not an easy man to overlook once you had looked at him properly. She told herself it was gratitude. Then she told herself it was the practical warmth of having an ally after years of fighting alone. Both of these things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. March came in cold and then began its grudging transition toward warmth, the way Texas marches always did, pretending for a week that spring might not arrive before finally relenting. Joel's herd came through the winter in better shape than he had feared. The grain from Virginia's reserve had done its work, and the breeding stock he had spent 2 years developing was intact. The loss he had dreaded came to nothing. He found himself at the mill more often than strict business required, sometimes with genuine purpose, a question about the next season's milling capacity, a discussion about a new contract he was considering with a farming settlement 30 miles north, information from Patterson in San Antonio about Dole's movements. But sometimes with less strictly defined purpose, arriving in the mid-morning when the mill was at its busiest, and Virginia was managing the operation with the same focused capability that he had stopped being surprised by and had started simply watching with pleasure. She did not miss these visits. She was too observant to miss them. But she was cautious in a way that had been built by experience, by watching her father trust too quickly and pay for it, by watching what happened to women on the frontier who gave their trust and their dependence to a man before they understood what kind of man he was. One morning in mid-March, Joel arrived to find her in the machinery room with her sleeves rolled up to the elbows and her hair escaping its pins in the familiar way, elbow-deep in the boiler's water inlet system. She was replacing a faulty valve, which she was doing with the easy competence of someone who had been maintaining this equipment since she was tall enough to reach it. Bart and Clem were both present but both looking slightly helpless around her. Joel stopped in the doorway and watched. She worked methodically, checking each connection, tightening each fitting with exactly the right pressure, running a diagnostic that she had clearly done so many times it was reflexive. When she finally pulled back and nodded to Clem to test the pressure, and the system ran without the grinding hesitation that had been present before, there was a brief, satisfied expression on her face that was entirely private, directed at no one, just her own assessment of a thing done correctly. Then she looked up and saw Joel in the doorway, and the expression shifted to something more guarded. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Hayes." He held up a package. "I brought the winter tally sheets. The ones Patterson asked about for the legal documentation. You could have sent them with Amos. I was coming into town anyway," he said, which was not strictly true, but was not strictly false either. She looked at him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading more of the truth in his face than he had intended to show. Then she took a clean rag from the bench beside her and wiped the valve grease from her hands and said, "Come through to the office." Over coffee, which was by now its own small ritual, Virginia told him that the judge had sent word that morning. He was prepared to issue a notice to Cyrus Dold requiring a formal response to the allegations of deliberate contract interference. It was not yet a ruling. It was not yet even a formal proceeding. But it was a signal that the judge found the evidence credible enough to open a review, and in the small world of regional business networks, a signal from a judge carried weight. Joel felt a tight satisfaction at this. "That's significant." "It might be enough," Virginia said carefully. "Dold operates on the premise that people he pressures will not fight back effectively. If it becomes clear that fighting back is exactly what is happening, his calculation changes. He might decide this property is not worth the exposure. And if he doesn't decide that, then we build the case further," she said. "I have 3 years of records, every contract, every payment, every interaction. The pattern is documented." Joel looked at her across the table and said something that he had been not saying for several weeks, the kind of thing that accumulates until it needs to be spoken. "You have been carrying this alone for a long time." Virginia looked back at him steadily. "Yes, since your father died. Before that, really. He was unwell for the last year of his life. I was managing most of the actual operations by then. And before the illness." "Did he know how much you understood about the business?" A small pause. "He knew I was competent," she said. "I think there were moments he was surprised by how much I knew, which always surprised me a little since I had spent every available hour learning from him. But he did not question that you should continue the work." "No, he never questioned that." Her voice carried something tender about this, briefly visible before the practical surface reasserted itself. "He was a good man in that way. He saw what was in front of him rather than what he expected to see." Joel thought about this. Then he said, very quietly, "I see what is in front of me, Miss Hayes." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It was charged with something that both of them were aware of and neither of them addressed directly. Not yet. Virginia looked at her coffee, then at the window, where the early spring light was coming through with a quality that would have made a painter reach for a brush. Then at Joel, who was watching her with the patience that was entirely characteristic of him, waiting without pressing, offering without demanding. "Joel," she said, using his first name for the first time, and then stopped, as if she had not entirely planned to do that and was now in territory she had not charted. "Virginia," he said back, gentle, and that was it for a moment, just the two names in the room finding out how they sounded together. "I am not someone who falls into things," she said. "I make decisions carefully, I assess situations, I plan." "I know," he said. "I am also not someone who lets fear make my decisions for me." "I know that too." "What is it that you're suggesting?" she asked, direct as a carpenter's line. Joel set down his coffee cup. "I would like to court you," he said. "Properly, with your knowledge and your consent, and at whatever pace is right for you. I am not suggesting anything else." Virginia was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Why?" he blinked. It was not the response he had prepared for, though in hindsight it was entirely consistent with her. "Why? Why me specifically? What is it you think you want?" He thought about it genuinely, not reaching for a polished answer but actually considering. "Because you are the most capable person I have met in years," he said finally. "Because you built a secret reserve against a future betrayal and did not tell anyone and stood in a cellar and showed it to me like it was nothing. And in that moment, I understood something about the kind of mind you have and the kind of person you are. Because when you laugh, it is always at something that is actually funny. Because you treat your workers with fairness and talk about machinery with affection and fight for what is yours with everything you have." He paused. "And because you make me want to deserve respect from someone who does not give it automatically." Virginia had gone very still during this speech. The guarded composure that was her natural resting state had not broken, but something behind it had shifted, and Joel could see the shift even if he could not see what it revealed. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I find dishonesty costly in the long run," he said. She looked at him for another long moment. Then, "I am not easy to court, Joel. I am set in my ways and I have opinions, and I will not defer to judgment I disagree with simply because the judgment comes from a man." "I would not want you to," he said. "I also will not give up the mill. I never assumed you would." She looked at him, and whatever she was reading in his face apparently satisfied something in her assessment, because she said, "All right." He let out a quiet breath. "All right. Coffee on Thursday," she said. "We can start there." He nodded and took his hat and went. Outside, passing Amos Tate, who was waiting with the horses, he was apparently wearing an expression that made the old foreman look at him sideways. "Well," Amos said. "Quiet, Amos," Joel said, and swung up into the saddle with more ease than usual. The Thursday coffees became a rhythm, and then the Tuesday occasional visits, and then the Sunday afternoon rides when the weather allowed it, Virginia on her bay mare and Joel on his black gelding, riding the Coldwater Creek valley as the spring moved in properly, and the grassland came back to life in that particular shade of green that was so vivid after the brown of winter that it almost seemed implausible. Virginia was exactly as she had described herself, set in her ways, opinionated, entirely disinclined to defer. She had read more than almost anyone in the county, her father's bookshelves having been substantial and her own additions to them more so. And she had opinions about economics, and about the railroad expansion, and about the treatment of the Comanche and Kiowa people who had been pushed off the land that now made up the ranches and farms of this region. Opinions that she expressed with a clarity that sometimes made Joel's comfortable assumptions about things sit up and reassess themselves. This was not always easy for him. He was, as she had guessed, a man who was sometimes inflexible when he believed he was right. But he was also fundamentally honest, and when her arguments had the better of an exchange, he acknowledged it, not gracefully always, sometimes with a visible effort that made her want to laugh, but genuinely. She watched him with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, watched how he treated his workers, watched how he handled the situation when one of his hands made a mistake that cost the ranch money, and saw that the response was firm but not cruel. Watched how he talked about his father who had died 6 years ago, with a grief that was still present but held without self-pity. Watched how he was with the horses, easy and confident and unhurried. She assessed all of this carefully, and what she found was consistently what she hoped to find, which was a relief so deep she had not known she had been bracing against disappointment until it did not come. Cyrus Dold made his countermove in early April. It came in the form of a letter from his San Antonio legal representative, delivered to Virginia at the mill, asserting that the Hayes Mill had been in technical noncompliance with a specific loan covenant since the previous autumn, and that this triggered an acceleration clause requiring full repayment of the outstanding loan balance within 60 days. The letter was legal, aggressive, and clearly designed to arrive before Judge Harlan's review process had moved to a formal finding, hoping to force a financial crisis before the legal protection could materialize. Virginia read the letter twice, then set it on her desk and sat very still for approximately 2 minutes, running the numbers in her head, not because she did not know them already, but because she needed the clarity of running them again to confirm what she already knew. She could not repay the full balance in 60 days, not from the mill's current cash flow. She sent a message to Joel. He arrived within the hour, having apparently been at the county supply store when the message reached him, and the speed of his arrival without fanfare or unnecessary commentary was noted by Virginia as more meaningful than any speech could have been. He read the letter. His jaw tightened. Then he said, "The acceleration clause. What are the specific grounds?" "A covenant about maintaining minimum monthly milling output," she said. "He's claiming that 2 months last autumn when I reduced output while running the reserve accumulation constituted a breach. Did it technically? Technically, possibly. The covenant language is ambiguous. That's what I need to challenge. But the 60-day clock starts now regardless." Joel set the letter on the desk. "What is the balance?" she told him. He did not react visibly to the number, which was significant. "I can lend you the full amount," he said. Virginia looked at him. "Not a gift," he said immediately, correctly reading her expression. "A business loan, standard terms. You would repay it from the mill's revenue over an agreed timeline. No acceleration clauses, no covenant traps. Simple terms on paper that we both sign in front of a witness." He paused. "This eliminates his leverage immediately. Whatever legal case is built against him proceeds without you being in financial distress during it. You fight from a position of stability instead of crisis." Virginia said nothing for a long moment. "This is a significant amount of money," she said. "I know. You would be taking a risk on the mill's ability to repay." "I know the mill's books," he said. "You've shown me enough of the operations over the last 2 months. The Hayes Mill is a sound business being attacked by someone who does not like that a woman is running it successfully. I am not worried about the repayment." She looked at him very carefully. "Joel, I need you to understand something clearly. Tell me. If I accept this loan, it is a business arrangement. It does not change anything else between us. It does not give you any stake in the mill. It does not create any obligation beyond the financial terms we agree to. It does not make me owe you anything that is not on the paper." "I know that," he said quietly. "Virginia, I know that. I'm offering this because the situation is unjust and I am in a position to address the injustice, not because I want something from you in return." She held his gaze for a long time, long enough that it would have been uncomfortable for most people. Joel held it without difficulty. "All right," she said. "Let's write the terms." They spent the next 2 hours at her office table, writing the loan agreement with the same careful thoroughness that Virginia brought to everything. Every term was explicit. The repayment schedule was conservative, giving the mill room to absorb seasonal variations in revenue. The interest rate was fair. There was no acceleration clause. There were no covenants. It was the cleanest contract Virginia had ever seen, and she had written it herself, with Joel contributing only clarifications and no changes. When it was done, they rode together to the office of the county clerk, a meticulous man named Aldous Price, who witnessed their signatures with the raised eyebrows of a person finding the situation somewhat unusual, but being professionally committed to not expressing this. Virginia paid off Dold's loan the following Monday, delivering the full balance via bank draft to his San Antonio representative, with a letter from her own legal counsel noting that the acceleration clause had been responded to in full and requesting a formal written confirmation that all loan obligations were discharged. The confirmation came back 10 days later. The loan was closed. Joel had nothing left to work with on the financial angle. Judge Harland, meanwhile, had been progressing through his review of the evidence, and in late April he issued a formal notice that the court would hear arguments on the question of deliberate commercial interference. This was not a criminal proceeding, but it was a civil one with teeth, and Joel's own legal counsel apparently advised him that the Kansas precedent combined with the Texas documentation made the case uncomfortable enough to consider settlement. Joel settled. He made no admission of wrongdoing, which frustrated Virginia somewhat, but his legal representative agreed to a reimbursement of demonstrable business losses caused by the contract interference, which was a concrete and meaningful outcome. Judge Harland's order included a formal notation of the court's concern about the business practices involved, which would follow Joel's name in the county court records. It was not everything Virginia had wanted. It was not justice in the complete, clean sense that the injustice deserved, but it was a wall built around the Hayes Mill that was considerably stronger than before, and it closed the immediate threat. The afternoon after the settlement papers were signed, Virginia walked home to the mill through the warm April evening and stood in the mill floor in the quiet after the workers had gone home and looked at the machinery her father had built and she had maintained, and she allowed herself to feel briefly the full weight of what she had carried and what she had managed to hold. She was not a crier, but she stood there for a few minutes with her eyes bright and her breathing careful. And then she collected herself and went upstairs to her living quarters above the mill office and changed out of her work clothes and sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the late light on the creek. There was a knock at the outer mill door about an hour later. Joel. He had a small bunch of wildflowers in his hand, the kind that grew along the creek bank, purple and yellow and slightly ragged from being carried horseback. He was holding them with the self-conscious air of a man who has done something impulsive and is no longer entirely certain of its reception. Virginia looked at the flowers, then at his face. She stepped back and let him in. They sat on the steps outside the upper entrance, the ones that faced east toward the creek, and they watched the last of the evening light move across the water. Joel had put the wildflowers in a tin cup with water which Virginia had provided without comment. The flowers looked cheerful in a homemade way. "It's done," Joel said. "Yes." "How do you feel?" "Relieved," she said, "and a little strange. I've been fighting this for so long that the fighting became normal. Not having it to fight feels disorienting." He nodded. He understood this. "The ranch was like that after I stabilized it in the early years. I kept looking for the next crisis for about a year because crisis was what I knew. Did you find one?" "I manufactured a few unnecessarily," he admitted. "Then I figured out what I was doing and stopped." She smiled. "How?" "Found things worth enjoying," he said. He did not look at her when he said it, but he did not need to. The evening was quiet around them, the creek making its patient sound below, a mockingbird somewhere in the cottonwood trees sending up its remarkable plagiarized song. The air was warm enough to sit in without a coat for the first time since autumn. Virginia looked at the wildflowers. "I have not had someone bring me flowers in a long time," she said. "Do you like them?" "Yes," she said, simply and without qualification. "I like them very much." Joel turned to look at her then with the particular directness that was his defining feature, that absolute absence of pretense that she had come to recognize as one of the most valuable things about him. "Virginia." "Joel, I would like to kiss you," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she leaned toward him and answered the question in the most definitive way available. It was a gentle kiss, unhurried, the kind that comes from certainty rather than urgency. His hand came up to her jaw, barely touching, more a presence than a hold. Her hand rested on his arm. The mockingbird continued its elaborate theft of other birds' songs. When they separated, they sat quietly for a moment, and then Virginia said, in a tone that was entirely matter-of-fact, "I knew in the cellar." He blinked. "Knew what?" "That you were someone I could trust. I saw it in your face when you looked at what I had built. There was no condescension in it, just genuine respect. That is not as common as it should be." Joel was quiet for a moment. "I knew earlier than that," he said. "When you said I was not looking for a rescuer, not because it was defiant. Because it was accurate. That was the moment I understood who you were." Virginia tucked this away in the organized interior of her heart, where she kept the things that mattered. "This will not be simple," she said. "I am not a simple person. I know. I will continue to run the mill. I would never expect otherwise. And I will continue to have opinions." "God help me," he said, and the warmth in his voice was so genuine that she laughed again, that real laugh, and he caught it again with the same expression as the first time, like someone receiving a gift they had not expected. Spring moved into summer and summer into the full golden blaze of Texas autumn. And things changed, and things deepened in the way of things that are built properly rather than rushed. Virginia repaid the first installment of the business loan in July, on the exact date specified, to the exact amount, because she was Virginia Hayes, and this was what she did. Joel accepted the payment with an expression that was half amusement and half something that was just love, plainly, sitting there on his face. The mill expanded its contracts that summer, picking up 2 farming settlements to the north that had previously used the distant mill, and who appreciated the shorter transport distance and Virginia's practical, no-nonsense approach to contract terms. Revenue climbed. The loan repayment schedule that had been conservative became, in practice, accelerated, because the mill was performing beyond the original projections. Joel came to the mill often. Virginia came to the ranch sometimes, which caused Amos Tate to behave with the concentrated casualness of a man trying very hard not to seem delighted. She met the ranch hands, who received her with the slightly wary respect that competent outsiders get in close-knit working communities, and over a few months she earned something less wary from them through the practical demonstrations of who she was. One afternoon in September, there was a mechanical failure on the hay baler that had the ranch hands baffled, a seized linkage mechanism that nobody could quite diagnose. Virginia, who had ridden out to have dinner and found the scene of frustrated men gathered around the disabled machine, walked over and asked to look at it, examined the mechanism for about 3 minutes, identified the problem, and told them what tool was needed to clear it. It was the same process she used on her own mill machinery. The ranch hands stared at her, then at each other, then fixed the baler in 20 minutes. Amos Tate found Joel after this and said, with studied understatement, "You should probably marry that woman." Joel looked at him. "Working on it, Amos." "Work faster," Amos said. He proposed in October in the mill cellar. This was intentional. The cellar where the reserve grain had been stored was now partially emptied, the reserves having served their purpose through the winter, but it was still the place where everything had started, and Joel felt that its significance deserved to be acknowledged. He had asked Virginia that morning to show him something in the cellar, a pretext so thin it was practically transparent, and she had known it was a pretext, and had descended the cellar stairs anyway with a composure that she maintained right up until he pulled the ring from his pocket. It was not an elaborate ring. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, which he had chosen because he had seen Virginia wear turquoise earrings twice and thought she must like it. He was right about this. "Virginia Hayes," he said, and then said the rest of it simply, without excessive performance. He told her what she meant to him. He told her what he hoped for. He asked not in the conditional or the performative sense, but with the genuine question of a man who understood that the answer was truly hers to give and not his to expect. Virginia looked at the ring, at him, at the cellar around them with its faint smell of grain, dust, and lime and history. "Yes," she said, and then because she was Virginia, obviously, he laughed. She kissed him. Somewhere above them, Bart and Clem, who had been given no reason to be in the mill at that moment but were in it nonetheless, very quietly, told each other that they had not heard a thing. They were married in December of 1878, on a Saturday morning when the cold was sharp and clean, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were bare and silver. The ceremony was held in the small church on Coldwater Creek's Main Street, conducted by the Reverend whose name was Marsh, and who was a decent man with a gift for brevity in ceremonies, which both Virginia and Joel appreciated. The guest list was small by choice and large in quality. Amos Tate, who was visibly moved and visibly determined not to show it. Virginia's neighbor Mrs. Adler, who cried freely and without apology. Judge Harland and his wife. Patterson's contact from San Antonio who had helped build the Dold case. A jovial man named Hector who had ridden up for the occasion. Bart and Clem, dressed with the careful formality of men who owned very few formal clothes and had treated each item with impressive respect for the occasion. Virginia wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, a cream-colored wool with a pattern of small embroidered flowers at the cuffs and hem. Her hair was up properly, all of it, for one of the few occasions in her adult life. She looked, standing at the front of the church beside Joel, like a woman who was entirely certain about what she was doing, which was exactly what she was. Joel wore his best coat and had made a genuine attempt at his hair, which Amos Tate had observed that morning and described privately as bold. The vows were the traditional ones, and when it came to obey, Virginia had spoken quietly with the Reverend beforehand, and Marsh, who was indeed a decent man, had adjusted the wording for both of them to honor and cherish, which suited both parties and raised no particular objection from anyone present. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the mill, because Virginia's living space above the office was where her life was, and because the mill's main floor, cleared of the machinery's immediate work area, made a surprisingly accommodating party space. Mrs. Adler had organized the food, which was considerable. Hector had brought a bottle of something from San Antonio that was better than anything available locally. There was music from a fiddle player who appeared from the direction of the saloon and turned out to be surprisingly good. Joel danced with Virginia, which he did with the same patient, unhurried quality he brought to everything. She was a better dancer than he was and did not pretend otherwise, and he accepted this without any of the masculine difficulty it might have caused in a different man, simply following her lead when she was better positioned to lead and finding his own footing when he was. Amos Tate watched this and said nothing to anyone, because some things did not require words. They built their life with the same deliberateness that each of them had always brought to building things. Virginia continued to run the mill, because of course she did. The Hayes Mill, which now carried the additional informal designation of the Mercer Mill in some county records, though Virginia used the original name in all her own documentation and contracts. It expanded again in the spring of 1879, adding a third grinding station and taking on a full-time apprentice miller, a young woman named Clara who came from a farming family to the north and who showed the same instinctive feel for machinery that Virginia had noticed in herself at that age. Joel's ranch had the best breeding season it had seen in a decade. The grain supply, now under a formal long-term contract with the mill at terms that were fair to both parties and documented with Virginia's characteristic precision, was reliable, and the herd reflected it. Amos Tate, who had been doing the work of 3 men for 15 years, was finally given a proper assistant foreman, a young man named Diego who was from a Mexican ranching family and whose horsemanship was extraordinary. The Dold matter was not entirely closed in the sense of justice, because it rarely was with men like Cyrus Dold. He operated his San Antonio trading house with somewhat diminished reach in the Texas counties, where Judge Harlan's notation in the records had preceded him. He found other places and other people to pressure, which was a painful truth about the world in 1878 and in most other years. But he did not come back to Coldwater Creek, and the Hayes Mill stood. In the summer of 1879, Virginia came down to the mill floor early one morning and found Joel already there, as he sometimes was when he stayed the previous night, sitting with his coffee and reading through a contract she had left on the office table. He had that look he sometimes got with her business documents, the focused, respectful attention of someone engaging seriously with material that was not his native expertise but that he respected enough to try to understand. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment without speaking. He looked up and found her watching him and smiled, that real smile that still broke across his face like weather clearing. She walked across the floor and sat down across from him and stole the contract to check something, and they sat with their coffee in the morning quiet and the mill around them and the creek outside and the year's light coming in through the windows. "I want to tell you something," Virginia said. He set down his cup. The way he gave his full attention to things she said was still one of the things she appreciated most about him. "We're going to need to rethink the upper storage arrangement," she said. He looked confused. "Why?" She looked at him with the particular steadiness that she had used when she was waiting for him to catch up to something she already knew. Joel looked at her for a moment. Then the understanding moved through his expression in stages, the confusion clearing to attention clearing to a wide, unguarded, completely genuine delight that she had never seen on his face before at that exact intensity. "Virginia." "March," she said. "Early March, I think." He stood up from the table and came around to her, and she stood, and he held her with the careful, somewhat overwhelmed tenderness of a man discovering that some kinds of happiness are just larger than what he had prepared himself for. "A baby," he said, not quite believing the word. "Yes," she said. "A baby. So we will need to reorganize the upper storage because I am going to need that room, and I would appreciate it if we made the decision together rather than you simply arriving one day with lumber." He laughed, still holding her. "I would never arrive with lumber without telling you first." "You absolutely would," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "You have opinions about lumber." "I have appropriate opinions about lumber," he said. She pulled back enough to look at his face, which was still wearing that unguarded happiness, and she reached up and touched his jaw with one hand in the simple, direct way that was the most affectionate thing she did, the gesture reserved entirely for him. "We will be good at this," she said. It was not a hope. It was an assessment. "Yes," he agreed. "We will." Their son was born on March 3rd, 1880, on a cold, clear morning that reminded Virginia irresistibly of the February morning 2 years ago, when Joel had walked into her mill looking like a man who had swallowed something bitter. She thought of this at some point during the long, difficult work of the birth, attended by Dr. Caulfield and Mrs. Adler, and found it somehow funny, the symmetry of it, the way things curved back around. Joel was outside the bedroom door for the entire duration, which was the convention, and which he found approximately as comfortable as standing in a burning building would have been. Amos Tate sat with him for part of it, maintaining the kind of company that was simply presence, not words, which was what was needed. When Dr. Caulfield opened the door and told him he had a son, Joel stood up so quickly he nearly knocked the chair over. The boy was healthy and solid and possessed of a formidable pair of lungs that he demonstrated immediately. Virginia was exhausted and clear-eyed and held the baby with the same competent attention she brought to everything, examining him with a thoroughness that made Dr. Caulfield smile. Joel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, with an expression that required no translation. "Henry," Virginia said. "I want to name him Henry, after my father's father." "Henry," Joel said. He tested the name. "Henry Mercer." "Henry Oliver Mercer," she said. "Oliver for my father." "Henry Oliver Mercer," he said. "Yes." They stayed in that room for a while in the quiet that follows enormous events, the three of them, while outside Coldwater Creek went about its day, and the creek moved as it always moved, and the mill stood as it had always stood. Henry Oliver Mercer grew into a sturdy, curious boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's build, and an early and passionate interest in both cattle and machinery that delighted both parents for different reasons. He spent his early years divided between the mill and the ranch, with the natural ease of a child who belonged equally to both worlds, which was exactly what he was. Virginia went back to work at the mill, to no one's surprise, approximately 3 weeks after Henry's birth, with Henry present in a cleverly designed arrangement of a padded crate near the office desk that she refused to call a cradle because the mill was not a nursery, but was in practice functioning as one. Clara, the apprentice miller, turned out to have a genuine gift for the work and for Henry's company both, and became something between an employee and a member of the family in the way that frontier communities often produced, boundaries being somewhat permeable when everyone was working for survival and mutual benefit. Joel expanded the ranch's north pasture in 1881, completing the project he had planned before the winter crisis of 1878. The fencing went up across the full boundary of the acquisition, solid work done by hands who by now were a stable, reliable team under Diego's increasingly confident leadership. Amos Tate supervised from horseback and offered commentary that was sometimes useful and always entertaining. In the evenings, when the work was done and Henry was asleep and the mill was quiet and the ranch was settled for the night, Joel and Virginia sat on the steps outside the mill's upper entrance, the ones that faced the creek, as they had sat on the evening when everything had first shifted between them. They talked about the day's work, about Henry's latest discoveries, about the next season's plans. Sometimes they sat without talking and listened to the creek. Virginia had kept the tin cup, the one she had put the wildflowers in on the evening of the settlement. It sat on the shelf in the mill office, repurposed as a holder for pens and pencils, still slightly stained from the stems. It was not a sentimental gesture exactly. It was simply that it was a useful cup and she saw no reason to throw away useful things. Joel had noticed it, of course, in the way that he noticed things about her environment. He had not mentioned it. He did not need to. In the spring of 1882, their daughter arrived. They named her Ruth, which was Virginia's choice, and she arrived in the world with the same easy confidence with which she would go through it, sleeping peacefully from the first night and watching everything around her with a dark-eyed attentiveness that reminded everyone of her mother and made Joel laugh with a helpless delight that he made no attempt to conceal. Henry, who was 2, examined his sister with the scientific seriousness of someone conducting a significant investigation, and then declared her acceptable, which Virginia said was the highest praise available from a 2-year-old, and Joel said was entirely correct. The loan was fully repaid in 1883, ahead of the agreed schedule, because the mill's revenue had grown consistently, and Virginia's management of it had been exactly as sound as Joel had calculated when he made the loan. She paid the final installment on a Tuesday morning and wrote the formal confirmation of full repayment herself, and handed it to Joel at the breakfast table with no ceremony, because that was her way. He took it, read it, and looked at her. "The mill is fully yours," he said. "The mill was always fully mine," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him across the table where Henry was eating porridge with the aggressive focus of a 4-year-old, and Ruth was observing the room from her position of being held by Clara, who had come by in the morning. "But now there is no piece of paper in the world that says otherwise," she said. "No," Joel agreed. "There isn't." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers briefly, the simple, direct gesture that was hers alone, and then she said, "Good. Now eat your breakfast before Henry takes it." Henry looked up from his porridge with an expression of perfect innocence that convinced absolutely no one. Coldwater Creek changed, as frontier towns do, through the early 1880s. The railroad came closer, which changed the economics of grain transport and created both pressures and opportunities that Virginia navigated with the same systematic intelligence she had always brought to the business. A second hotel opened. The schoolhouse expanded. New families arrived from the east. bringing with them different expectations and different experiences that mixed into the existing community with the friction and the richness that all genuine mixings produce. Virginia became, without particularly intending to, a central figure in the county's women's civic organization, which was formed in 1883 with Mrs. Harland as its first president, and which worked on educational access, community welfare, and the particular challenge of ensuring that women who came to the frontier could access basic legal protections that were theoretically available but practically inconsistent. She brought to this work the same clear-eyed, practical competence she brought to everything, and her reputation in the business community gave her words a weight in conversations with county officials that many women's voices did not yet carry. Joel supported this without reservation, and also without making a performance of his support, which Virginia found considerably more valuable. He watched his wife change the county in small, incremental ways, doing it while running the mill and raising 2 children and being precisely who she had always been. And he thought sometimes about the cellar and the reserve, and how the thing she had built in secret in anticipation of a future threat was a perfect illustration of how she moved through the world. She built reserves. She planned for the worst and hoped for the best, and when the worst came, she was already ready. He thought he was probably the best reserve she had ever built. He told her this one evening, sitting on the creek steps, and she looked at him sideways for a moment, and then said that the metaphor was structurally unsound, because reserves were by definition stored against the future, and he had already been present for years, but that she understood what he meant and found it not entirely wrong. "Not entirely wrong," he said. "I'll take it." "You'll take it," she agreed, and leaned into his shoulder in the easy, companionable way they had settled into over 5 years of marriage, the way that close bodies have of knowing each other without needing to think about it. Henry Oliver Mercer, at age 5, could identify 16 different mechanical components of the mill by name and 3 different cattle breeds by physical characteristic. His parents found this entirely appropriate and only mildly alarming. Ruth Mercer, at age 3, had opinions about everything and expressed them with a clarity that made visitors blink and made her parents look at each other with the helpless, delighted recognition of people seeing themselves reflected in small, concentrated form. The creek ran on. The mill ground on. The cattle on the Mercer ranch's north pasture grazed through seasons that came and went with the patient repetition of time measured in grass and snow and grass again. The wildflowers came back every spring along the creek bank, purple and yellow and ragged, exactly as they had always been. Joel came home to the mill one autumn evening in 1884, having been out to the north pasture fence line for the day, and found Virginia in the office with the lamp lit, and the account spread in front of her, and Clara sitting opposite with a question about the winter contract terms. Henry was asleep upstairs. Ruth was asleep. The mill was quiet and the evening was gold and cool through the window. Virginia looked up when Joel came in and said, without preamble because she was Virginia, "The Miller family from Fort Worth is interested in a partnership arrangement. I want to tell you about it." Joel hung his hat and sat down across from her and said, with the full attention that was the thing she had fallen for first and that 5 years had not diminished by a fraction, "Tell me." And she did. Outside, the Coldwater Creek ran on in the dark, reflecting the last of the day's light. The mill stood in its place at the edge of town, solid and real, its machinery quiet for the night but waiting, the way it always waited, ready for the morning's work. The grain stores were full. The reserve was always full. Virginia Hayes had made certain of that. Some things you built in secret against a future that tried to take everything from you. Some things you built in the open, slowly, with a person who saw you clearly and loved what they saw. The best things, Virginia knew, were both at once. The lamp burned in the office window of the Hayes mill late into that autumn evening, and the voices inside it went on talking, planning, building, the way they always had and always would, against whatever winter was coming, and for everything the spring would bring.